You're watching the moment a war stops being a headline and becomes a system, one that can reach into your gas bill, your grocery cart, your job market, and your ballot box. The skies over Iran aren't just contested airspace tonight. They're a message, written in jet fuel, precision strikes, and political timing, that says the rules have changed. And when the rules change, the costs don't stay overseas. Before we begin, if you value clear-eyed analysis without the noise, subscribe to this channel. It helps us keep making the kind of reporting and commentary the public actually deserves. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of the economics and politics, and today we break down what's shaping our world. Here's the truth most people won't say out loud. The first decisive battlefield in modern war isn't the desert or the sea or the border. It's the sky. If Israeli and U.S. warplanes dominate Iran's skies, then this conflict stops being a question of who wins the next exchange and becomes a question of how long can Iran survive the pressure of permanent vulnerability. Air dominance compresses time. It corners leadership. It drains morale. And it forces your opponent to make bad choices faster than they want to. That's why sky control is not just a military advantage, it's a power structure. When one side controls the air, it controls the rhythm of reality. It decides when nights are quiet and when they become sirens. It decides which roads stay open and which become rivers of fleeing families. It decides whether a regime can project strength or only absorb punishment. And in a world where perception moves markets, air dominance is also financial dominance. It raises the risk premium on everything connected to the war: oil, shipping, insurance, investment flows, and political stability. Let's name what's happening, plainly. In this war is spilling beyond the Middle East, and that spillover is not an accident. It's the natural consequence of a conflict where the goals are bigger than a single battlefield. When a U.S. Navy submarine torpedoes an Iranian warship off the coast of Sri Lanka, the map changes. When NATO air defenses shoot down a Turkey-bound missile, the map changes again. When Israel intensifies operations against Iranian-backed Hezbollah and orders evacuations across southern Lebanon, the map isn't just changing, it's lighting up. This is the new map of fear. Not a single front line, but a network of pressure points. The message is simple. Nowhere is truly out of theater anymore. And that matters because the global economy is a network too. War that touches shipping lanes and allied airspace doesn't stay contained. It moves through supply chains. It moves through energy prices. It moves through insurance rates. It moves through politics, especially in democracies where cost of living is the ultimate referendum. Now here's where we have to be serious and honest. There's a difference between overwhelming force and a coherent endgame. Military dominance can destroy, it can humiliate, it can disrupt, but it cannot by itself build a stable outcome. And if you're a working American, that distinction isn't academic. Because the length of this conflict and whether it has a plan will determine whether economic shock becomes a temporary spike or a grinding months-long squeeze. Let's talk about the internal battlefield inside Iran, because it's not separate from strategy, it's the point. When people describe a city being bombed, they're not describing collateral. They're describing a social system under stress, communications cut, uncertainty multiplying, basic routines collapsing into a daily endurance test. A country under bombardment becomes a nation running on adrenaline and fear. And fear is expensive. Fear changes behavior. It empties shelves. It triggers bank runs. It drives people to flee. It crushes productivity. It destroys trust in institutions, either pushing people toward revolt or tightening the regime's grip through repression. And that's the ugly truth. Air dominance can produce two outcomes at once. It can weaken a regime's ability to fight, and it can also harden a regime's willingness to punish its own people to survive. If you've studied history, real history, not slogans, you know this pattern. Shock campaigns don't guarantee political collapse. Sometimes they produce desperation. Sometimes they produce fragmentation. Sometimes they produce a long, bitter period where the state survives, but society bleeds. So what do the power players do when they sense an asymmetry? They shift the battlefield. Watch, this is basic strategic economics. what game theorists call changing the payoff matrix. If Iran cannot match air dominance plane for plane, it will try to raise the price of air dominance elsewhere, in maritime routes, in regional bases, through proxies, through disruptions that are cheap to execute but expensive to defend against. That's why spillover matters. It's not random chaos. It's a search for leverage. And let's not pretend the allies category is clean and stable. In NATO, downing a missile bound for Turkey isn't just a technical interception, it's a political threshold. Turkey is not just another country in the region. Turkey is NATO territory. And the moment NATO has to act in real time against an Iranian threat, the war steps closer to alliance dynamics, where misunderstandings, domestic politics, and red lines multiply. The most dangerous wars are not always the ones leaders choose. They're the ones leaders stumble into because the machinery of alliances, near retaliation and credibility, begins to run itself. Now bring this back home, because you deserve the straight line from dominate the skies to your life. When war expands, markets don't wait for certainty. Markets price risk now. Oil is not just a commodity, it's a political asset. Shipping is not just logistics, it's the bloodstream of trade. The moment insurers believe routes are threatened, premiums rise. When premiums rise, costs rise. When costs rise, inflation pressure rises. And when inflation pressure rises, politics heats up. That's the cycle. That's the system. This is why air dominance isn't just about bombs. It's about bargaining power. It's about credibility. It's about deterring some actors while provoking others. It's about whether the United States can project strength abroad without importing instability at home. And that's the test in front of us. Can Washington and its allies sustain military pressure without losing economic and political legitimacy, especially if civilian harm allegations and legal questions gain traction? Here's my forecast, and I'm not saying it to be dramatic. I'm saying it because the incentives point this way. If Israeli and U.S. warplanes continue to dominate Iran's skies, expect strikes to go deeper, leadership pressure to intensify, when Iran's response to become more asymmetric and more regionally disruptive. If NATO keeps getting pulled into defensive actions, expect alliance hardening, more air defense deployments, tighter rules of engagement, higher alert posture. And if shipping routes and energy flows keep getting threatened, expect Washington to treat economic stability as part of the battlefield, because for American households it already is. The question that matters now is not whether dominance exists. It does. The question is whether dominance is paired with discipline, because dominance without discipline doesn't end wars. It expands them. And that's the new map of fear, not just where missiles fall, but where the next shock will travel, through markets, through alliances, through governments, and straight into the everyday lives of millions who never voted for this war, but will pay for its consequences. The torpedo in the Indian Ocean. Why the IRIS Dena changes the world. The torpedo strike in the Indian Ocean is the kind of event that looks like a single dot on a map until you realize it redraws the entire map. When a U.S. Navy submarine sinks the Iranian warship IRIS Dena off the coast of Sri Lanka, it doesn't just remove a ship from the water. It removes a belief from the world, the belief that a conflict has edges. In modern power politics, edges are everything. Once they define what's inside the war and what's outside the war. They decide which governments can stay neutral, which markets can stay calm, and which citizens can pretend the crisis is far away. The IRIS Dena strike takes a machete to that illusion. Let's be clear about the facts we're anchoring to. Sri Lankan authorities said the Iranian frigate IRIS Dena sank on Wednesday off Sri Lanka, with 32 sailors rescued and more than 100 missing or dead. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said a U.S. submarine sank the warship in international waters, an announcement framed as a historic milestone, the first time since World War II that an American submarine had attacked a surface vessel. Those details matter because they aren't just operational. They are narrative weapons, and narratives in wartime are currency. Hegseth's language, quiet death, a ship that thought it was safe, isn't accidental. Tony, it's a deliberately staged signal to three audiences at once. First, to Iran, you cannot relocate risk by relocating geography. Second, to allies, Washington can project lethal force beyond the expected perimeter. Third, to markets. The United States is not simply reacting, it is expanding the envelope. Whether you consider that stabilizing or destabilizing depends on your politics. But the strategic effect is the same. Uncertainty rises, and uncertainty always has a price tag. And here's why this strike is different. Naval warfare has always been about choke points and deterrence, but it also depends on shared assumptions about where escalation belongs. For decades, the global system has lived on an unspoken compromise. Keep the really disruptive violence away from the arteries of commerce unless you are prepared to own the consequences. When you sink IRIS Dena in the Indian Ocean, you're not just sending a military message. When you're raising the probability that the global shipping system becomes a battleground, whether through retaliation, miscalculation, or opportunistic copycats, and that's where the financial motive structure becomes visible. War is not only fought with weapons, it's fought with costs. The side that can impose costs, economic, political, psychological, without paying proportional costs gains leverage. The IRIS Dena strike is cost imposition in its purest form. High visibility, high humiliation, and high uncertainty, delivered with low direct risk to American personnel. In game theory terms, it's a move that tries to shift Iran's expected payoff. Your Navy is not a shield, it is a liability. But here's the part policymakers often underestimate. When you corner an adversary, you don't eliminate their agency, you redirect it. Iran's rational response is not to match American strengths, it's to target American vulnerabilities. And American vulnerabilities are rarely about hardware. They're about legitimacy and economic stability. Start with legitimacy. Any war that crosses geographic expectations triggers a legal and moral argument, and that argument becomes a weapon in its own right. The claim of self-defense expands when the battlefield expands, and the scrutiny expands with it. If Washington says this is defensive, then skeptics will ask, defensive against what? At what distance? Under what rules? With what proof? Those questions don't just happen in academic journals. They happen in parliaments, in allied capitals, and in the minds of voters who are already exhausted by expensive conflict. Legitimacy is not a luxury. It is supply lines for political support. Now look at the economic system. The moment a navy is effectively sunk, as the rhetoric suggests, the obvious follow-up is not celebration. It's anticipation of retaliation, where the retaliation hurts the most. Shipping, energy, insurance, and regional infrastructure. Well, markets understand that instinctively. Underwriters understand it faster than anyone. War risk premiums don't rise because a ship sinks. They rise because a ship sinking changes what seems possible tomorrow. And tomorrow's fear has direct pathways into American household economics. Energy price expectations shift quickly when the world starts to look less predictable. Shipping costs don't stay on the ocean. They land in retail prices. When volatility rises, investment becomes more cautious, hiring slows at the margin, and the public feels it as things are getting tighter. This is why the IRIS Dena strike matters to a factory worker in Ohio and a nurse in Arizona. Not because they track naval tonnage, but because they live inside a system where risk is converted into cost. There is another layer that doesn't get enough attention: sovereignty optics. Sri Lanka is not a backdrop. It's a state with its own politics, its own public opinion, and its own exposure. When a major power fight erupts near your coast, your government is forced into decisions about rescue, investigation, public messaging, and jurisdiction. Each decision creates pressure from competing patrons and domestic factions. Even if Sri Lanka tries to stay careful and procedural, the mere fact pattern turns it into a contested space. And that leads to the broader world change question. What does it mean when great power combat actions occur near the sea lanes of South Asia? It means the global order is sliding toward a model where geography doesn't grant neutrality, only capability does. If you can't enforce your preferences in your surrounding waters, then others will enforce theirs. That is not a moral judgment. It is the historical rule of power politics, from the age of empires to the Cold War, repackaged for a globalized economy. Iran's leaders will read this strike as a humiliation, and humiliations have predictable consequences. They harden resolve among some factions, generate blame among others, and create pressure to answer in a way that restores deterrence. That answer does not have to be symmetrical. It has to be resonant. It has to signal that costs can flow both directions. The danger isn't only what Iran chooses, it's what Iran's proxies, rivals, and opportunists interpret as permission to do. So here is my forecast, grounded in incentives rather than wishful thinking. First, expect Iran to seek visible, deniable ways to raise costs, especially where global commerce is sensitive. Second, expect Washington to expand maritime security posture, because once you signal that a theater is global, you inherit global protection duties. Third, expect the legal and legitimacy debate to intensify, because every widening action creates new audiences and new standards. And finally, expect the economic echo of this strike to grow louder with each additional incident. Because the world's financial system is built to price risk faster than governments can explain it. The torpedo that sank IRIS Dena didn't just punch a hole in a ship. It punched a hole in the assumption that this war would stay where it started. And when that assumption sinks, everything floating on top of it, diplomacy, commerce, and public patience, starts taking on water. NATO, Turkey, because Cyprus, the Article 5 shadow in the edge of collective war. The missile that forced NATO to act wasn't just a projectile. It was a political probe, an attempt to see whether the world's most powerful alliance still has the reflexes, unity, and discipline to hold a line under stress. NATO downed a Turkey-bound ballistic missile, and in that single interception, you can hear the quiet machinery of collective war trying to decide whether to start moving on its own. And this is the uncomfortable reality. Alliances don't only deter enemies, they also create automatic pressures on friends. When Turkey is in the frame, NATO is in the frame. Not as a talking point, not as a press release, as a system with obligations, expectations, and credibility at stake. And credibility is a form of capital. Spend it recklessly and you lose deterrence. Fail to spend it when it matters and you invite escalation. That is the trap NATO was built to manage. And it's the trap Iran is increasingly willing to test. According to the reporting tied to this escalation, an Iranian ballistic missile was headed toward Turkey and was shot down by NATO air and missile defense systems in the eastern Mediterranean. NATO publicly emphasized it, stands firmly with all allies, including Turkey, while Turkey called for restraint to avoid further escalation. A Turkish official said the missile had been aimed at an unspecified military base in Cyprus, but veered off course before NATO intercepted it. And there, inside that single sentence, is the entire crisis. Ambiguity. A missile aimed at Cyprus, veered off course, intercepted on the way to Turkey. No one wants to be the person who overreacts to ambiguity. No one wants to be the person who underreacts to a threat that turns out to be real. That's how wars widen. This is why Article 5 is not just a clause. It's a psychological threshold. Leaders can downplay it in press conferences, and U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did downplay suggestions that attacks on Turkey would trigger NATO's collective defense clause. But the alliance does not operate on mood. It operates on signals and precedents. If NATO can be forced to intercept Iranian missiles near its territory, even once, then the question stops being, will NATO get involved? The question becomes, how often does NATO have to act before the alliance begins to treat the pattern as a direct campaign against it? And let's talk about Cyprus, because this is where the war's geometry turns lethal. Cyprus is not simply an island in the Mediterranean, it's a strategic platform. It's the kind of place wars use, quietly, until a drone strike or missile changes the label from platform to front. The United Kingdom is already acting on that reality. HMS Dragon is being loaded with ammunition in Portsmouth and is expected to deploy toward the Mediterranean to help defend Britain's base in Cyprus after RAF Akrotiri was hit by a drone. Wildcat helicopters armed with Martlet missiles are being deployed ahead of the warship. This is not theater. This is Allied infrastructure moving into a higher-risk posture. So what's the power structure here? It's simple. Iran doesn't need to defeat NATO. Iran needs to complicate NATO. If Tehran can create uncertainty about targets, trajectories, and intent, if it can force NATO to repeatedly spend interceptors, raise alert levels, and debate internal thresholds, then it can widen the war politically without widening it militarily in the conventional sense. That's a classic asymmetric strategy. Make the stronger actor pay higher maintenance costs just to keep the system stable. Now layer in the financial motive. Missile defense isn't free. It's one of the most expensive forms of defense on Earth, not only in hardware but in readiness. Crews, sensors, integration, constant posture. When you fire interceptors, you burn inventory that must be replaced through supply chains and budgets. Oh no, every additional day at heightened alert increases operating costs. And here's what most taxpayers don't hear. The more frequently these systems are used, the more the alliance must either surge production or accept risk gaps. That's not just a military problem. That's a fiscal problem, especially in democracies where the public has already absorbed inflation, high interest rates, and fatigue from overseas commitments. This is where domestic politics comes roaring into what people think is foreign policy. NATO leaders don't only weigh strategy, they weigh parliaments, they weigh elections, they weigh coalitions that can collapse if the public believes the war is drifting into another open-ended commitment. Iran understands that. So do opportunists who want NATO to look divided. And that's why the missile interception matters. It's a moment where the alliance must be both strong and restrained at the same time. An incredibly difficult posture to maintain under pressure. The Cyprus angle also matters because it touches the special relationship and the broader alliance bargain. When RAF Akrotiri gets hit by a drone, it becomes more than a British issue. It becomes a shared credibility test. Can Allied basing remain viable under threat? If bases are perceived as vulnerable, NATO logistics become harder, missions become more complicated, and the cost of sustaining operations rises. That's how a war turns into a prolonged economic drain, even for the side with superior firepower. And there's another darker layer: escalation by misinterpretation. A missile that veered off course is a phrase that should make every serious analyst uneasy, because in high-intensity conflicts, off course might mean malfunction. It might mean interception, altered trajectory. It might mean a feint, or it might mean a warning shot. The problem is not which interpretation is true. The problem is that each actor will choose the interpretation that best serves its interests and then act on it. That's how you get spirals. So where does this go? Here's my strategic forecast based on what alliances do when tested at the margins. NATO will harden its air and missile defense posture around Turkey and key nodes in the Eastern Mediterranean. Because once you've had to intercept a missile, you plan for the next one. Turkey will keep calling for restraint publicly because Ankara understands that escalation could make it a battlefield. But Turkey will also quietly strengthen readiness because restraint without preparedness is just wishful thinking. The United Kingdom will move assets like HMS Dragon and Wildcat helicopters, not because it wants a wider war, but because deterrence requires visible capability. And the United States, this is crucial, will try to keep NATO inside a defensive frame while expanding offensive pressure elsewhere. That's the balancing act. Prevent the alliance from being pulled into a formal war while still maintaining initiative. Hegseth's public downplaying of Article 5 risk fits that objective. But messaging doesn't control physics. A single missile, a single drone, a single misread radar track can push events faster than diplomats can slow them down. If you're an American viewer, understand what is at stake here. The moment NATO's defensive systems become routine participants in this conflict, you are one step closer to a broader alliance confrontation that will not be measured only in battlefield outcomes. It will be measured in budgets, in energy markets, in shipping risk, and in political cohesion. That's what Iran is testing, not whether NATO can shoot down a missile. NATO can. The test is whether NATO can shoot down the missile and still keep the war from expanding into the alliance's own identity. This is the edge of collective war, the place where a single interception can either stabilize the situation through deterrence or destabilize it by creating a pattern. NATO is walking that edge right now, and the world is watching because on the far side of that edge, the conflict stops being a regional crisis and becomes a global commitment. Would Trump host tech leaders as Iran tensions? Rise, power, energy, and the domestic front. While the world watches missiles and warplanes, President Trump is doing something that looks on the surface completely different. hosting tech leaders, shaking hands, announcing an electricity pledge, and promising Americans that their utility bills will go down, not up. But don't be fooled by the split screen. This is not a separate story. It's the same story, told in the language of domestic survival. Yes, because in the United States, wars don't end first on the battlefield. They end first at home. When the public decides the costs are too high, the purpose is too unclear, or the leadership looks like it's improvising. Trump understands that. And whether you love him or hate him, you cannot deny he is treating the home front as a strategic theater. Here's the core idea behind the event. Trump is trying to weld together three pillars of power: military strength, economic confidence, and technological dominance into one political narrative. When Iran tensions rise, the most dangerous secondary effect for an American president is not criticism from foreign capitals. It's inflation. It's the slow bleed of confidence. It's the feeling that life is getting harder while Washington is getting louder. So Trump is trying to cut off that fear at the source. He brings in Speaker Mike Johnson. He elevates Energy Secretary Chris Wright. He puts David Sachs, framed as the AI and crypto czar, into the room. And then he stages the corporate roll call like an index fund of American power. Ruth Porat for Google, Brad Smith for Microsoft, Brad Lightcap as COO of OpenAI, Matt Garman for Amazon Web Services, and Gwynne Shotwell for xAI. This is not just a meeting. It's a coalition photograph. It signals to voters, investors, and allies that the U.S. industrial core is aligned with the White House, and that alignment will supposedly translate into stability. The centerpiece is the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, and it's worth dissecting because it's a rare thing in politics, a real mechanism, not just a slogan. The logic is simple and politically potent. Americans are hearing that AI data centers are exploding across the country and consuming electricity at enormous scale. Communities worry their rates will rise. Utilities worry they'll have to invest billions. The regulators worry about backlash. And the political class worries about one thing above all: a new driver of cost of living pain. Trump's answer is to push the burden onto the companies that want the power in the first place. In this framework, big tech commits to cover the cost of increased electricity production required for AI data centers, which so consumers won't pick up the tab. He goes further. He pushes the idea that data centers should build your own power plant, and he sells it as a permit revolution, approvals in weeks instead of decades. That's a structural shift. It changes who pays, who builds, and who carries political liability when something goes wrong. If you zoom out, this is industrial policy wearing a market suit. The government isn't nationalizing the grid. It isn't building state-owned plants. Instead, when it's saying private giants, you want dominance in AI, then you fund the energy backbone yourselves. And the state's role is to accelerate approvals. Trump explicitly praises Lee Zeldin's permitting approach, so the bottleneck moves from bureaucracy to capital deployment. In theory, that speeds everything up. In politics, speed is a weapon. It creates visible progress before the next election cycle. But speed also creates risk. Permitting fast means somebody is making trade-offs: environmental review, community input, grid resilience planning. Trump is openly hostile to what he sees as bureaucracy, and he talks about running government like a business. That line gets applause because Americans are tired of delays and incompetence. But as an analyst, I'm obligated to tell you the other side. Running government like a business can also mean externalizing costs until they explode in the public's lap. So the question isn't whether the pledge sounds good. It does. The question is whether the pledge holds under stress. Trump lists commitments that, on paper, address the main fault lines. Companies will provide or pay for power generation, help upgrade delivery infrastructure, negotiate separate rate structures so costs are assigned cleanly, invest in local communities and workforce development, and even contribute backup power to local grids during times of need. If those commitments are real, if they don't just protect ratepayers, they could modernize the grid. They could create jobs that don't require a four-year degree. They could produce a new wave of skilled labor demand: electricians, engineers, HVAC techs, welders, network technicians, the kind of work that sustains families and towns. That's the inspiring version of this story, A high-tech future built on real infrastructure, not vapor. But here's the hard truth. Tech companies don't sign pledges out of charity. Nah, they sign because it protects their growth model. AI dominance requires energy at scale. If communities block data centers because they fear rate hikes, the build-out slows. If the build-out slows, the U.S. risks losing ground to competitors. So big tech has its own motive. Buy social license, reduce friction, and secure the power pipeline. Trump's motive is equally clear. Stabilize the domestic economy narrative while a war threatens to destabilize energy prices. And he talks about bringing bills down, about the Dow crossing 50,000 and the S&P hitting 7,000, and he frames the previous administration as an inflation disaster. Whether you accept his scoreboard or not, you should recognize the strategy. He's trying to preempt the classic political trap where foreign conflict translates into domestic hardship, and domestic hardship becomes electoral punishment. Now let's connect this to what Americans actually feel. Electricity is not an abstract commodity. Boy, it's rent. It's the AC in the summer. It's the heat in the winter. It's whether a small business can keep the lights on. When people believe prices are rising for reasons they can't control, they lose faith. And when faith collapses, everything becomes political chaos. Trump is essentially saying, we can wage conflict abroad, lead in AI, and still protect you at home. That's the promise. My forecast is this. If the war's pressure keeps building, the administration will lean even harder into this energy tech coalition. AI infrastructure will be framed as national security, grid expansion will be treated like wartime logistics, and permitting will become a political battleground, because every delay will be labeled sabotage and every shortcut will be labeled corruption. But there's also an opportunity here, and it matters. If the United States truly aligns energy build-out with technological leadership, without crushing families with higher bills, then we don't just survive this era of conflict. We come out stronger. We build a base of resilience, more power capacity, more skilled jobs, more infrastructure, and more leverage in a world where economic strength is the foundation of strategic strength. That's what's on the table in that room with Trump, Mike Johnson, Chris Wright, David Sachs, Ruth Porat, Brad Smith, Brad Lightcap, Matt Garman, and Gwynne Shotwell. It's not just a meeting. It's a bet on whether American power can be modernized fast enough to withstand a world that is getting more dangerous by the day. India, Sri Lanka, and the global South, the war's next diplomatic earthquake. What happens next in this war won't be decided only in Washington, Tehran, or Tel Aviv. It will be decided, quietly, relentlessly, in capitals that don't lead cable news panels, but do lead trade routes, energy flows, and diplomatic coalitions. This is where the war's next diplomatic earthquake begins. India, Sri Lanka, and the wider global South, the countries that cannot afford to turn this conflict into ideology because their first obligation is stability. When the Iranian warship IRIS Dena went down off Sri Lanka, it didn't only create a maritime incident, it created a political test with no comfortable answer. Bloomberg Economics put it bluntly, the episode risked friction with Washington and domestic embarrassment for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government. That line matters because it reveals something most Western audiences miss. Countries like India are not sitting on the fence. They are managing a high-wire act between power blocks while protecting their own economic lifelines. Modi's government is already facing criticism at home for not explicitly condemning U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, despite historical ties with Tehran. That single sentence captures the trap. India's domestic politics are not abstract, and they are not immune to the emotional charge of war. A government that appears too close to Washington can be attacked for abandoning traditional relationships and regional balance. A government that appears too soft on Iran can be attacked for undermining new partnerships and strategic opportunity. And in modern democracies, India's included, perception can swing faster than policy. So India is balancing, but it's balancing in an environment where the room is shaking. Bloomberg economics analysts Chetna Kumar and Adam Farrar stress that they don't view the IRIS Dena episode as a clear indicator that the conflict is widening to South Asia. That's an important break on panic, but it's also not a comfort blanket. Because even if the battlefield isn't moving to South Asia in a conventional sense, The strategic consequences are already there. The presence of a U.S. submarine in an area where India and Sri Lanka often conduct joint patrols is likely to raise strategic concerns in New Delhi. Translation: India may have space to distance itself publicly, but it cannot ignore what this implies privately. This is where sovereignty and leverage collide, where Sri Lanka's authorities describe the sinking and the rescue. The incident's location, tied to Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone, creates diplomatic room for India to keep its posture measured. But the geographic fact also creates a security headache. If a major power can operate in sensitive waters and strike a high-value target there, the regional order of who controls what becomes less certain. And when control becomes uncertain, will smaller states feel pressure from every direction to cooperate, to protest, to investigate, to accept help, to refuse help? Each choice makes new enemies and new dependencies. This is how a war becomes a great power competition accelerator. Now step back and look at India's incentive structure in plain economic terms. India needs affordable energy. It needs stable shipping lanes. It needs investment flows. It needs to protect its citizens abroad. And it needs to maintain strategic autonomy without triggering retaliation from the world's largest economies. That's not ideology. That's national survival math. Bloomberg Economics notes Modi's ties with the U.S. are already being tested by tough tariff talks and uncertainty over how his government will implement its trade agreement with the Trump administration. That detail is not a footnote. It's the fuse. When trade talks are tense and war risk is rising, security and economics start to merge. Access becomes leverage. Cooperation becomes conditional. And every neutral position becomes harder to sustain because both sides start asking for proof of loyalty in the form of behavior. Votes at the United Nations, enforcement choices, port access, intelligence posture, procurement decisions. This is why the Global South is so central now. Not because it will pick a side out of love, but because it will pick a behavior out of necessity. Here's the key point Americans should understand. The Global South doesn't experience war as a moral debate first. It experiences war as a price shock first. Oil prices, fertilizer prices, shipping rates, insurance costs, tourism losses, remittance volatility. Those are immediate. That's why the Global South's alignment often looks inconsistent to Western observers. It's not inconsistency, it's triage. And the IRIS Dena detail that it was in India in February for the International Fleet Review, alongside vessels from 40 countries, including the US and Russia, adds another layer. It shows how intertwined these networks already are. Naval diplomacy, port visits, trade corridors, security cooperation. These aren't separate channels. They are one web. In a crisis, a tug on one strand moves the entire structure. So what's the likely political trajectory for New Delhi? First, expect India to tighten its language while keeping its options open. That means statements that sound principled but stay non-committal, calls for restraint, emphasis on sovereignty, emphasis on protecting citizens and trade. Second, expect India to increase maritime vigilance in practice even if it avoids dramatic announcements. Joint patrol geography makes this unavoidable. Third, expect back-channel diplomacy to intensify, not just between India and the U.S., but between India and regional actors who can influence escalation and energy stability. And Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka is going to feel the weight of proximity. In crises like this, smaller states become arenas for signaling, whether they want it or not. Sri Lanka will likely emphasize procedures, rescue, investigation, legal framing, because procedure is a shield. But procedure cannot erase the underlying reality. When big powers act near you, your neutrality becomes a negotiation, not a declaration. Now widen the lens to the entire Global South, because that's where the earthquake becomes visible. The Global South's core demand will be predictability, not perfect peace, but predictable risk, because predictable risk can be insured, budgeted, and absorbed. Unpredictable risk breaks economies. It shuts down investment. It triggers currency stress. It forces governments into emergency measures. And that's why you'll see an increased push for ceasefire language and de-escalation forums. often framed as humanitarian concern, but powered by economic necessity. My strategic forecast is straightforward. If this war continues to generate episodes like the IRIS Dena sinking near Sri Lanka, more global South states will begin to choose behaviors that reduce exposure, diversify suppliers, stockpile fuel, reroute trade where possible, increase defense readiness, and quietly align with whichever actors can guarantee stability, at least temporarily. Not because they trust them, but because stability is the currency that keeps governments in power. For American viewers, this matters because U.S. leadership in the modern era isn't measured only by military reach. It's measured by whether Washington can build coalitions that survive economic stress. If the global South begins to see U.S. power as a generator of instability rather than a guarantor of order, and then America's strategic position weakens, even if it wins battles. That's the diplomatic earthquake. It doesn't arrive with one dramatic speech. It arrives with 100 small decisions made in New Delhi, Colombo, and dozens of capitals across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Decisions shaped less by ideology than by the relentless, unforgiving demand of the public. Keep the lights on, keep food affordable, keep the currency stable, and keep the country out of the fire. And in this moment, not that demand is the most powerful force on earth. Tonight's story isn't about one leader, one missile, or one headline. It's about a system and the people caught inside it. In this war, the central character is power itself, how it moves, how it signals, and how it reshapes everyday life. Israeli and U.S. forces dominate Iran's skies, and that dominance isn't just tactical, it's psychological and economic. It compresses time, forces decisions, and turns uncertainty into a global tax. Then the battlefield expands in a way most Americans don't expect. The IRIS Dena is sunk off Sri Lanka, proving the conflict has no clean borders. NATO intercepts a Turkey-bound missile, and suddenly the shadow of collective defense hangs over the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, President Trump hosts tech leaders and sells a domestic shield. Keep utility bills down by making big tech pay for the electricity powering AI's future. And in the global South, India and Sri Lanka become unwilling reference points where sovereignty, trade corridors, and political survival collide. Prime Minister Narendra Modi must balance historical ties, domestic criticism, and pressure from Washington. Because in the modern world, neutrality isn't a flag you raise. It's a tightrope you walk. The lesson is sharp. In a connected economy, foreign crises are never foreign for long. Power wars don't just break buildings. They bend prices, politics, and public trust. The practical application for your life is this. Build resilience the same way nations must. Reduce exposure to volatility where you can. Budget with buffers. Avoid debt traps. Invest in skills that travel across industries. And stay informed enough to separate real risk from manufactured panic. The goal isn't fear. The goal is clarity. Because clarity is stability. Quick poll for you. What do you think matters more in the next phase of this crisis? A. Military dominance in the air and at sea. B. Economic stability, energy prices, shipping, and public confidence. Comment A or B below. And I want your take. Do you believe this conflict can be contained, or are we watching the start of a wider global realignment? Share your view in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. If you want more sharp, plain language analysis, subscribe to support the channel so we can keep building the next episode together.